hasn't been able to find one single case. She's an expert in pharmacology and opiates, which the medical examiner in Seattle was not.
So they basically spent how much time on this investigation before they closed the book?
They spent about half
30
an hour,
seconds
really,
after
because,
they walked in
they
the
say
door.
That they kept investigating it afterwards.
And
we accessed the police reports, and on the police reports, every division of the Seattle Police Department had already labeled it as suicide on the same day as Kurt's body was found. While Kurt was still lying in the greenhouse before his body was taken away, they had written suicide on the incident reports.
Because
there's no question that there was this rush to judgment.
Unbelievable. In all these years, they have refused to reopen the case.
Well, that's understandable. They're not going to admit that they made a mistake, egg on their face. I mean, this happens all the time. You read about it virtually every day in the newspapers that a case is reopened or a murderer gets off death row. Because
now, we're not saying, Allan, that Courtney killed Kurt. We want to make that clear. Although her act during the days leading up to Kurt's death are extremely, extremely suspicious. They conclusively reveal that she filed at least 2 false police reports, planting evidence that Kurt was suicidal. The police reports also explored a widely reported myth, the false idea that Kurt had barricaded himself inside a room before shooting himself. The incident in Rome was extremely suspicious. We have a taped admission from Courtney that at the time of Kurt's March 1994 overdose, as you may recall, Allan, in Rome, he had left her not a suicide note, as she later claimed, but a note telling her that he was leaving her.
She says this on tape. This is something, as soon as Kurt died, she started telling the media and Kurt's friends and the record company that the overdose in Rome a month before had actually been a suicide attempt, that Kurt had left her a note. Nobody had ever heard this before. Nobody talked about suicide. The doctor that treated him said that it wasn't a suicide attempt. The record company said it wasn't a suicide attempt. The spokeswoman for Gold Mountain, for his management company, said that he told her, and she said this after he died, that he told her after Rome that he wasn't trying to commit suicide. He just had taken all of his and Courtney's money and was going to run away and disappear. This is a spokeswoman for his own
In fact, I remember a friend of Kurt's telling us when we were in Seattle, Allan, Max and I, we hung out in all these underground drug dens trying to get to the bottom of this, meeting Kurt's friends. And a former drug dealer of Kurt's, he once told me, at the time, the only person, he said, who thought Kurt was suicidal was Courtney. Kurt was not suicidal. He was happy in his life.
He had no reason to be suicidal.
Now, well, a few months earlier, maybe, he would talk, occasionally he would give an interview where he talked about this stomach pain that he had experienced since he was a teenager, this agonizing stomach pain that doctors could never diagnose, where he couldn't even eat without this pain welling up. And he would give interviews occasionally where he would say the pain was so bad that he felt like blowing his head off, And after he died, of course, these interviews were trotted out, understandably, and they looked very prescient. But the fact is that in 1993, a doctor finally diagnosed the stomach pain and was able to treat it. It was a pinched nerve related to scoliosis. After that, you never hear him talking like this anymore. His friends say that he was very upbeat, that he never talked about the pain's so bad that I want to kill myself. He gave an interview to Rolling Stone in December '93, 4 months before he died, where he says he's never been happier in his life. This is something repeated by all his friends.
But if you were to listen to what Courtney was telling the press, he talked about killing himself every day.
Yeah, and then we talked to all these people that knew him best. His best friend, Dylan Carlson, who bought him the shotgun, told us, of course he wasn't suicidal. I never would have bought him a shotgun if I thought he was suicidal. He was very upbeat.
And let us not forget, Allan, that there was a gentleman, if you may recall, by the name of El Duce. And he claimed that Courtney offered him $50,000 to quote-unquote blow Kurt's head off. El Duce passed the polygraph with one of America's leading polygraph examiners, Dr. Ed Gelb. That's the same polygraph examiner who gave O.J. a test, and O.J. failed it. And Gelb said after the test that he's convinced that Eldon Hoke believed he was telling the truth.
This is the guy that teaches the advanced polygraph course for the FBI, considered America's leading polygraph examiner.
Incredible. Now, we're going to pause here. When we come back, I want to talk about motive, if any, that Courtney would have to eliminate Kurt, as hard as that sounds. And, I don't even want to, we're talking about the possibility of her being involved, and that's what the topic of this book is about, perhaps, and also all the other mysterious things surrounding. Now, you guys are not saying that she actually pulled the trigger.
No.
But all three of you think that she definitely knows something about this.
I've always said definitely she did not pull the trigger, because I know where she was when he died. But
this is really going to unfold here. We have a lot to cover, so we'll take a quick break. And we're not going to take calls yet. We might next hour, so we have a lot to talk about. The new book is called Love and Death, The Murder of Kurt Cobain.
You're listening to the Allan Handelman Show, rock and roll talk radio.
This is probably in the last decade the hottest subject we've ever covered on the show. We deal with a lot, you regular listeners. And there's the possibility that Kurt did not commit suicide. Now, we, for a while, were just about the only ones talking about it on a national scale. And now it's making news. Here's another segment from this past Friday's Dateline.
In this, their second book on the subject, Wallace and Halpern claim they now have pertinent information that will shed new light on the circumstances of Cobain's death.
The source of all the stories about Kurt being suicidal come directly from Courtney Love. Courtney Love telling the press, Courtney Love telling Kurt's friends that he was always suicidal. This is where it all comes from.
They claim that in the months leading up to his death, Cobain, whose songs often touched on depression, was not in fact suicidal. They say Cobain's friends told them that he was happy then, that he was preparing to make drastic changes in his professional and personal life, changes that also would have affected his wife. The couple's relationship, they say, was collapsing.
It's been described as a turbulent relationship. Was it also a violent relationship?
Absolutely. They definitely had a turbulent relationship in a sense. As their relationship progressed, it seemed more violence would come out.
In their new book, the authors rely in part on Private Eye Tom Grant, a former L.A. County Sheriff's deputy. Courtney Love hired Grant a week before Cobain's death, when her husband skipped over the wall of a rehab facility in Los Angeles and disappeared.
She was on some type of an upper, and she was very hyperactive and very animated and very angry.
He says after talking to Love on the phone, his gut told him something in her story didn't jibe.
Right away, the very first words on the telephone to her, to me, was a lie.
Grant says he decided to tape all of the phone conversations he had with Courtney Love.
So basically, every time you talked to her on the phone, you were rolling tape.
Right.
And we have Tom Grant on the show. We also have Max and Ian, the authors of the book Love and Death, The Murder of Kurt Cobain. And before we talk about the motive, guys, going back to this segment we just heard on Dateline, Tom, what were some of the things that what got you suspicious about Courtney early on?
Well, her very first phone call to me when she wanted to hire me, she said she wanted to hire me to find out who was using her husband's credit card. And then when Ben Klugman and I went over to the Peninsula Hotel and met with her and we walked in the door, the first thing she said to us was, "I lied to you on the phone. It's not somebody else using his card. It's my husband, and he left the rehab down here." And she went ahead and told us the whole story and how she's actually trying to track him down and trying to find out where he's at based on the credit card activities. So the whole thing started off with a lie, but that, people make up lies for one reason or another, and sometimes they're even semi-legitimate or they have their own personal reasons for them. But it continued. Practically every other sentence she said was one lie or another, or she was telling us about a story that she had planted in the media, in the press, or she would make a statement about how she had his credit card canceled, and without that credit card he would have no access to money, and he couldn't even catch a taxi cab or do anything, and here's a guy who was worth millions of dollars, and I just found that incredible and hard to believe. So it was just one thing after another that started raising, certainly yellow flags, and So when Ben and I left the room and started walking down the hallway, I turned to him. I said, "We've got to document everything in this case really well because it just doesn't smell right already, and somebody's missing. You know, we don't know what we're going to come up with here."
Ian, you want to add to that?
Alan, you have followed this case for just as long as we have now.
Mm-hmm.
What's your opinion as a journalist, a radio talk show host? You've seen a lot of the evidence. And, you know, you're one of the biggest rock and roll aficionados out there. I want your honest opinion.
Well, right from the